There are two reasons why these videos are going under the title Zen Get Real, a positive and a negative. On the positive note, the aim of Zen is to get back to reality, simply because, as it happens, reality is a great place to be. Now, of course, I'm not saying there's only one version of reality. When I use the word reality, I just mean less illusions. More specifically, I mean a state in which you can learn from reality. As for the negative angle, it's that many of us are completely out of touch with reality, so we need to get real. Anyway, let's start with the positive angle, the fact that to experience reality, to actually experience being present in our lives, goes well beyond what we would normally call being alive. It's certainly not just about being more relaxed or being able to take more effective decisions. But if I were to try to describe this experience of reality, my explanation itself could end up getting in the way. So what I'm going to do is describe the kind of unrealities that we're normally caught up in. Then, if we remove those unrealities, what we're left with will be reality. So, the main unreality or delusion which plagues our lives is displacement, the belief that we can be somewhere else apart from where we actually are. On the other hand, it is also important to recognize that over a period of time we can be somewhere else. Movement and progress are possible. In fact, trying to make progress is an essential part of being alive. So, any viable attempt to be present in our lives must also encompass the basic human need to make progress. In other words, the strategy we use to help us be present in the moment has to recognize that at each moment we're also making progress towards another, different moment. And this is the essential paradox which a practice of Zen meditation resolves. How is it possible to be involved in the process of change and progress, i.e. movement, and at the same time remain completely committed to the reality of this present moment? From now on, I'll refer to this as the Mumo paradox. In this context, displacement can be understood as an unrealistic strategy which we use to try to resolve the Mumo paradox, or more accurately, to try to avoid resolving it. But if we think about it for 5 minutes, it becomes obvious how unrealistic this displacement strategy is, because everyone knows that the only way to get somewhere else is by starting from where you are. That's just common sense. Then again, most Zen insights are common sense, and this one is so much a part of common sense that there's even a joke to illustrate it. A man hails a man in the street and asks him, "How do I get to the train station?" "Oh well," the other man replies, "I wouldn't start from here." We are like that other man who thinks he can forget about where he actually is but still somehow get where he wants to be, presumably by magic. For example, we might be at work and we're not happy, so we try to displace ourselves by imagining another situation where we think we will be happy, such as the weekend, when we'll be down the pub. Then, when we're down the pub and we're still not happy, we imagine how great it'll be at closing time when we've got this party to go to. Then, when we get to the party, we can't wait for people to turn up so that it'll all get started. Then, when the place is totally crowded but we still feel strangely disappointed, we console ourselves that we know another party, which will definitely be brilliant, next weekend. On one level, it could seem like I'm describing a trivial problem, but we've become so good at piling up these little displacement strategies that unless something changes, we are set to travel from the cradle to the grave without ever actually being present in our own lives. So the essential problem with displacement is that it focuses exclusively on trying to change our external reality. With this attitude, our present unchanged reality is worthless. So we try to jump ahead of ourselves to some hypothetical future reality, place where all our problems have been solved, and we can finally start enjoying life. In an extreme case, this can lead to people putting their lives on hold until they win the lottery, or at least get a better job. And the reason why we do this, why we convince ourselves that we really will one day get to a place where we'll no longer have any problems, is because it allows us to dodge the difficult question of how we need to change ourselves. We don't need to. Instead, we can just change the world around us till everything's totally sorted out. Then, even if we carry on being messed up, that won't be a problem, because it will no longer get in the way of us being perfectly happy. This is the extreme version of displacement, the one which fuels sales of lottery tickets, but there's also a less dramatic version which we use every day. This involves convincing ourselves that everything would be perfect, if only we could just get a seat, and a cup of tea, maybe a biscuit too, but make it a chocolate one, etc. And it's an indication of just how out of touch with reality we are that, even as each goal in this chain disappoints us, we're already putting our faith in the next one. The reason why this kind of displacement will never make us happy is neatly summed up by the first noble truth of Buddhism, which is usually translated, a bit melodramatically, as all is suffering. In fact, it can be better expressed in just 2 words: shit happens. In other words, you are never going to get to that hypothetical place where you've no longer got any problems. That is just not what real life is like. So we should stop deluding ourselves that we can make a success of life by removing all our external problems down to the very last one. Instead, we need to learn how to enjoy solving whatever happens to be our next problem. Because one thing's for certain, as long as we're alive, there is always going to be a next problem. In short, we need to change ourselves as well as changing our circumstances. And we need to learn how to enjoy the process of change as well as its end results. So, if the Western strategy of displacement is not a good way to resolve the Moo-Moo paradox, i.e. to find a way to change our lives without becoming dissociated from life itself, what about Eastern New Age strategies, such as acceptance? Just accept the way things are and be happy. Equally unrealistic. The main problem with acceptance is that, like displacement, it's a one-sided strategy. Displacement ignores the second half of the Moo-Moo paradox, the need to be actually present in our lives. But acceptance ignores the first half, namely the need for us to move so we can change the world around us. Ironically, embracing a one-sided strategy such as acceptance contradicts another concept which is very popular with New Age types, yin and yang, or the idea that life is best understood in terms of opposite but complementary virtues. Yin and yang should be about balance, but a lot of New Age types are still trapped in their old mental habits, so they end up overemphasizing one side of the equation, the yin soft virtues. Equally, society is full of institutions which overemphasize the yang solid virtues, such as the army, but their limitations are already well understood. Of course, not many people would openly say that we should overemphasize the yin virtues, but that's often what their attitude implies, so effectively that is what they're saying. And this causes major problems because any virtue, if taken to an extreme, becomes a vice. For example, if you're waiting for a bus and it turns up full and goes sailing past, it's obviously a good thing if you can just accept this and carry on living in the moment until the next one arrives. However, if it turns out that the whole bus service is being cancelled due to cutbacks, then you might want to think about the best way to test against this while you walk into town. If, to take it a bit further, you have to walk into town down streets running with sewerage because of the rampant corruption in local government, then protest starts to seem even more appropriate. And if, as you're walking into town, you regularly see people being dragged off the streets to be locked up in slave labour camps, some kind of resistance would definitely be a good idea. Now, obviously I've gone to an extreme there, but that is exactly my point. If you rely exclusively on one virtue, you automatically exclude its opposite. Then the logical conclusion of what you're saying ends up justifying the most ridiculous extremes, e.g. being willing to accept slave labour camps. Now, as I say, it's not that most Buddhists would actually claim that acceptance is the appropriate response to slave labour camps, but what often gets implied is that the acceptance needed in response to ordinary events, such as your bus not turning up, justifies the idea that we should simply accept everything life throws at us, ignoring the fact that this everything could also include slave labour camps. Basically, it's just sloppy thinking, but that can be enough to get you caught up in a deeply flawed strategy, such as just accept everything. And these kind of strategies, which are really just half-thought-out excuses to avoid reality, can turn Zen into what many other forms of Buddhism have already become in the West, a haven for woolly-minded, overprivileged people who like to pretend that we can solve all life's problems by just being nice in a very passive or yin sort of way. So instead of being biased in favour of yin or yang values, I'm going to suggest that the best way to resolve the Moo-Moo paradox is by combining both, with yin virtues, such as acceptance, allowing us to be in the moment, while their yang opposite, in this case struggle, puts us in motion. These two aspects of reality should be seen as part of a constantly changing balance, rather than mutually exclusive opposites. Then we can struggle for change or accept the way things are, depending on which is the most appropriate in any given situation. In fact, it can go a lot further than that, if we realise that the yin and the yang virtues are actually able to complement each other. In other words, we can struggle to master the art of acceptance, and equally, we can accept that life will always involve a certain amount of struggle. In short, being in the moment can be the same as being in motion, and one way to visualise this is to see each moment as not a stationary pinpoint, but as an infinitely small arrow which combines within itself both position and direction, presence and change, movement and the moment. In other words, all the virtues of movement, such as process and progress, are already combined within the stillness of each moment. So, it's not that I'm against acceptance. On the contrary, introducing an element of acceptance into the imbalanced way in which we usually struggle for change would be a big improvement. For example, if you have to struggle with someone bullying you at work, you might find yourself thinking, this shouldn't be happening to me. But what that actually means is, I can't accept that struggle is part of life, so I'm going to pretend this is just a horrible one-off event, then try to blunder through it as quickly as possible. And that is exactly what most people do, fueled by emotions such as anger, self-pity, etc. In contrast, a yin and yang approach, one which accepted the need to struggle, would allow you to say, okay, I accept that I've got to struggle with this problem, so how do I do that in the most appropriate way possible? By taking that attitude, you can still live life to the full and find new, more skillful ways to deal with your problems, in short, still flourish, even while digging yourself out from yet another load of crap that gets dumped on you. So, the essence of Zen enlightenment is a realization that what I'm looking for can only be found in this moment. More exactly, it can only be found by an ability to be in the moment. In other words, what we're looking for is not a particular situation, but a talent or knack which allows us to experience that situation in a certain way. So, for example, if you're preparing a meal to share with someone, you should enjoy the preparation rather than seeing it as only a means to an end, because life is about the process, rather than grasping for an end goal. And anyway, getting into the process is always the most effective, in fact, the only way to get to your end goal. So life is a process, rather than a series of arbitrary goals which we reach by crossing some kind of emotional wasteland. And there's a parallel here with my previous image, seeing the moment as an infinitely small arrow rather than a pinpoint, because that allows every moment to be a combination of a moment and a movement. So from now on I'm going to refer to being in the movement rather than the moment. In fact, one reason why we have so much difficulty being in the moment is exactly because we conceive of it as a static, infinitely thin slice of time. So, being in the moment ends up being about trying to grasp each particular moment as we go scooting past it. In fact, being in the movement is not about trying to seize a unique and elusive now. It's about getting into the flow, bearing in mind that when you flow with a river, the surface of that river is static in relation to you. So I'm afraid that's another paradox, being in the movement, but also in an eternal and unchanging now. To some people, the distinction between a moment and a movement may seem a bit subtle, but actually it can make the difference between failure and success in your practice of Zen. Trying to seize this moment is never going to work, because the act of seizing will crowd out the simple reality of what this moment actually is. If, on the other hand, we can connect with the movement, we find ourselves flowing along, part of life in a way which is nothing special, but at the same time profoundly joyful. In short, we need to learn to surf the movement, not seize the moment. And although a surfer rides a standing wave, that wave is made up of millions of moving drops of water. Likewise, at the very instant when we connect with the movement, we are simultaneously letting go of it so that we can connect with the next one. In other words, the skill we need to attain Zen enlightenment is not so much about being in the moment, as it's about acquiring a certain knack which enables us to pass from one movement to another movement with absolute fluidity. And once we can do that, we'll realize there is no gap between one movement and the next. So, in a nutshell, Zen is a form of training which helps you learn how to flow from one movement to the next.